them to the May conference of the California Association of Toxicologists, commonly referred to as CAT, in Anaheim, California, about a 2-hour drive from San Diego. His friend, Dr. Daniel Anderson from the LA County Coroner's Office, was organizing the event. Kristen, along with Dr. Robertson and fellow co-workers, attended the CAT conference together. Kristen attempted to avoid any impression of impropriety to minimize further office gossip, but that intention lasted approximately 1 day. Back at their hotel, Kristen and Dr. Robertson consummated their romance for the first time and decided not only did they have a future together, but they were destined for one another. Within days of the conference, their fling moved quickly into a passionate love affair. A week later, Kristen and Dr. Robertson began exchanging gifts and roses. When they came back to the office from lunch, sometimes freshly showered. On May 15th, the first in a long series of passionate emails between the two started. Sitting just a few feet away from each other, they would exchange long, flowery emails. Dr. Robertson wrote from his office, "The deepest love is being able to let down all barriers and give yourself to another who has done the same. This is what I feel for you." An hour later, a reply came from Kristen. "You're a beautiful person and an inspiration to me. I want nothing more than to give my all to you. My life, my love, my world." Their exchanges were straight out of a romance novel. That day's exchange of love notes ended with Dr. Robertson telling Kristen that he loved her. Her reply, "I'll be thinking of you and all our future has to offer. I can't wait for it to begin." That same day, Kristen was simultaneously sending emails to Greg stating that she loved him more than anything in the world and asked him if he could email her more often. 20 minutes later, she emailed Dr. Robertson telling him she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him.
The following day, she emailed her brother Brent to tell him she had doubts with Greg's ability to be a true life companion. She accused their parents of pushing her into the marriage because they had spent so much time and money on the wedding. She described Greg as unsupportive and said the most significant reason to remain in the marriage was to not disappoint their parents. The following week, both oblivious to the office gossip, Kristen and Dr. Robertson spent most of their working days writing ever more passionate emails to one another. Kristen stated she wanted to leave Greg and move to Australia to marry Robertson.
By Thursday morning of that week, the two were so indiscreet that Dr. Robertson's immediate boss found it necessary to address the rumors directly. He said, "I spoke to them about reports that were reaching me that there might be improper relationships between Robertson and Kristen. I told them we could not have a relationship in the senior subordinate chain of command, and it would be deleterious to the morale of that division." Dr. Robertson vehemently denied the rumors and immediately sent Kristen an email telling her to delete all of their emails, as they wouldn't be well received by office snoops. Later that afternoon, Robertson's boss called both him and Kristen into his office, asking that they avoid being in close proximity to one another as it made other co-workers uncomfortable. Part of Kristen's job had included logging all of the illicit drugs found at death scenes before they were disposed of by the sheriff's office. It was the absolute worst place for a recovering drug addict to be working. It was later determined that illegal drugs were kept in such a disorganized and unsecure manner that any toxicologist working at the medical examiner's office could remove drugs intended for destruction with impunity. Kristen later admitted to smoking meth at the medical examiner's office during work hours in the high-pressure liquid chromatography room because the strong smell was quickly dissipated by the vented machine. Even Dr. Robertson would later agree that the office system for drug storage was woefully inadequate. However, it would be another 6 months before he discovered how Kristen was using the system's weaknesses to support her drug addiction. Dr. Robertson was soon promoted to the position of chief toxicologist. He would now be in charge of all toxicology work at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office. Kristen was delighted and hid a congratulations card in his desk. Dr. Robertson would regularly place gifts and roses in a box under his desk with love letters for Kristen to find. They would continually give each other different colored roses with long, passionate love letters about the various meanings of the colors. Roses would become a special language of love between the two, each color signifying a different emotion. Kristen saved many of the rose petals in her desk.
In June, Dr. Robertson was summoned to a meeting with the medical examiner, Dr. Brian Blackburn, and San Diego homicide detective Terry Torgerson. It was explained that a death from 5 years earlier, which had been ruled an overdose, was in fact allegedly caused by a fentanyl overdose. As the San Diego Medical Examiner's office didn't test for fentanyl, Dr. Robertson had sent it out to his old employer in Pennsylvania. It would later be claimed that Kristen and Dr. Robertson made use of the facts that fentanyl was not part of the regular tox screening for opioids conducted by their office.
The newly promoted Dr. Robertson decided that the upcoming SOFT conference would be a good opportunity for another romantic getaway, and arranged to have Kristen in attendance to co-present a paper, of which he was the primary author. However, everything changed in mid-July when Greg found one of Robertson's love letters. Kristen admitted to having strong feelings for the doctor, but denied anything physical was going on. Greg telephoned Dr. Robertson, whom he had recently met at a social function, and demanded he have no further inappropriate interactions with his wife. He also threatened to call the medical examiner and reveal their affair. To Kristen's relief, he didn't do that. But despite these warnings, the affair not only continued, it heated up. In mid-September, Kristen started writing a journal of, quote, self-discovery, unquote. However, she never mentioned in her diary her relapse with drugs or her love affair with Dr. Robertson. Later, prosecutors would claim it to be a cliché-ridden journal, written for the sole purpose of deceiving Greg into believing her to be faithful and drug-free. In mid-September, she had lunch with her mother, explaining her desire to leave Greg. Her mother was supportive and offered to help her move out that very day. She told her mother she was apartment hunting and planned to leave Greg in early November. Kristen and Dr. Robertson headed to the SOFT conference, having booked just one room for the two of them. Later, they would alter hotel receipts and be reimbursed for 2 rooms out of the medical examiner's budget. Once they arrived, they were given materials that included an 8-page article on fentanyl written by Dr. Daniel Anderson from the Los Angeles Medical Examiner's Office, entitled 25 Deaths on Fentanyl. A few days later, they would both attend a presentation at the conference on fentanyl overdoses resulting in unintentional death or suicide. Later, Kristen's old friend Frank Barnhart, who had hired her for the medical examiner's office and had tried to hire her at the sheriff's department, commented she wasn't wearing her wedding ring at the conference. Dr. Robertson and Kristen then announced that they were now a happy couple, explaining they were in love with each other and in unhappy marriages with other people. Dr. Anderson said he wasn't surprised but didn't approve and thought it unfair to their respective spouses. Kristen followed him out of the reception hall, teary-eyed, saying how much she and Dr. Robertson valued him as a friend and respected his position. He said he didn't want to be part of a drama-filled scene, so he tried to avoid her the rest of the night.
Kristen returned back to San Diego more in love than ever and determined to separate from Greg by whatever means necessary. From the moment Greg picked her up from the airport after returning from the conference, the arguments between them began. Greg became suspicious that his wife had had a relapse on drugs and searched Kristen's purse. Greg found 3 different types of drugs. In an angry email, Kristen attempted to explain away each of the pills he found as something innocent. She accused Greg of violating her trust by searching through her purse and even alleged she wanted Greg to find the pills to prove a point that he doesn't trust her.
On October 25, 2000, Kristen celebrated her 24th birthday. The night before, Dr. Robertson hid roses and chocolate in her desk. Her husband gave her 24 red roses. Kristen, running low on meth, and also the funds to obtain it, began looking into alternative sources to maintain her daily habit. That day at work, she made several web searches on how to synthesize meth. That evening, she logged onto Greg's computer at home and conducted searches on, quote, making crystal meth easy, unquote. That same evening, Dr. Robertson wrote Kristen a 2.5-page letter urging her to make a lifelong commitment to him and hinting he would leave her and move on if she didn't act now. The whole situation was playing out like a soap opera. On the Friday before Greg's death, Kristen became obsessed with obtaining more meth. She continued web searches for making the drug. In desperation, she took an extended lunch, crossed over the border, and met a local taxi driver in Tijuana who instantly became her drug dealer. He gave her his card and told her in the future to call him directly and he would meet her at the bridge with her drugs. On Thursday, November 2nd, Kristen alleges she was at home reading a love letter from Dr. Robertson when Greg caught her. After he wrestled the letter out of her hands and read it, he then accused Kristen of being on drugs again. She stated, quote, he almost struck me. He read the letter and was infuriated by it and was storming around, unquote. Kristen grabbed the letter and attempted to shred it. According to Kristen, Greg snatched it from the shredder and attempted to tape it back together. At one point, Greg allegedly became so incensed that he threatened to take the letter to the medical examiner and reveal her affair along with her drug relapse.
The next day, Kristen stopped smoking meth in the event that Greg went to her boss and she was asked to take a drug test. She then went to Dr. Robertson's office and told him about Greg's ultimatum.
That evening, Kristen's parents took Greg and Kristen out to dinner for Greg's upcoming 27th birthday and Kristen's 24th birthday. The Rossums would later say that Greg was acting odd that night. Kristen's mom tried to talk her into leaving with them that night, but unbeknownst to her parents, Kristen had a plan of her own. Greg's threat to expose her affair and drug relapse had scared her. Meanwhile, Greg was at home tending his hangover from the drinks his wife had given him the night before. During a phone call that morning with his brother Bertrand, he complained of feeling tired and hungover. This phone call with his youngest brother would be the last contact he would have with anyone other than Kristen.
At 9 p.m. on Sunday night, Kristen left the apartment to call Dr. Robertson. This call lasted just a few minutes, and prosecutors believe this call sealed Greg's fate. Stay tuned for part 2, where we will unravel how the sordid love of ignited more than a fiery passion between them, but escalated to involve a plan that would permanently remove Greg de Villers from the equation. A scandalous case that would later become known as the American Beauty Murder. There's a few people we really have to thank for helping put this episode together. Firstly, and most importantly, Devin, Steve, and Joe from the podcast Thinking Sideways. I've been a huge fan of their show, and I can't tell you how exciting it was for me to work with them. Sawyer Westbrook and the team from Resonate Recordings for their assistance in editing this show. And finally, a special thanks to Stephanie Moore, who researched and wrote this episode. Now, at this part of the show, I normally say, I'd like to introduce two podcasts, but I kind of have a feeling you already know them. They're huge supporters of our show, and we think the world of them. The Generation Y podcast.
How you doing tonight, Aaron?
I'm doing fine, Justin. How are you?
I'm doing great. We are the Generation Y, and we've been around quite a while.
Since 2012.
We've been doing true crime, murder mysteries, conspiracies,
Controversies.
wrongful convictions,
Missing persons cases.
anything and everything under the sun. Here's what you can expect.
They didn't know it, but they were 1,000 feet or so from where these three girls were being held captive.
When he brings these young ladies back to his house,
They would have this chain wrapped around their neck and their stomachs
and they're beaten.
under the control of a psycho. I mean, he lied about everything. Now you can't trust anything he's done.
I think this is anyone's worst nightmare.
These women were killed in one place and then taken and dumped somewhere else.
That chaos, that unpredictability made him so terrorizing.
The strongest evidence they have is the eyewitness testimony of a 6-year-old boy.
He placed his body underneath the house. I think this is less of a story about a monster and more of a story about survival.
We're Generation Y. Look us up on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, and hit the subscribe button.
And they walk among us.
They Walk Among Us is an award-winning true crime podcast. From the sinister and surreal to the brutal and bizarre, join us to hear more on the UK's most notorious and obscure crimes. Featuring well-known cases like the life and crimes of the UK's most violent inmate Charles Bronson, to the sad tale of the Gibbons twins whose string of petty crimes would lead them to be trapped in Broadmoor for 11 years before their eventual release ended in tragedy. We also cover lesser-known cases like the woman who murdered a husband with an ornamental frog and kept him mummified in her shed for 18 years, or the teenager that used his elaborate online fantasy life to plot his own murder. Listen and subscribe to They Walk Among Us through Acast, Apple Podcasts, or your favourite podcast provider.
The opinions expressed in the following episode do not necessarily reflect those of the Minds of Madness podcast. Listener discretion is advised.
A murder case with Hollywood overtones, including a poisoned husband, a staged death scene, and a beautiful woman being sentenced to prison for life.
It was an overdose of the painkiller fentanyl that killed him. A quantity was missing from the county medical examiner's office where Kristen worked as a toxicologist.
The victim died of poisoning, whether it was fentanyl or some other poison that was found in his system. The fact is that he was poisoned to death and that Ms. Rossum is responsible for that.
The murder case has been a tantalizing one.
When we last left off in part 1, Kristen's double life and extramarital affairs had finally caught up with her. She was no longer able to hide her duplicity from those who were closest to her. Her parents, suspecting something was wrong, offered her an alternative, a way out. They offered love and support and suggested a divorce. Fearing Greg's reaction would lead Kristen to losing her job and the discovery of her drug addiction, She found herself at a crossroad, each path with its myriad of consequences. The path she chose in the end had deadly repercussions. Join me now as we uncover Kristen Rosum's conniving plan to ensure she'd be free to pursue her budding new romance with the doctor, while ultimately shattering and destroying the man who had tried to rescue her from her destructive self.
When Kristen woke at 7 a.m. on Monday, November 6th, it is suspected that Greg was unconscious due to the drugs Kristen had slipped into his drinks the night before. As Greg lay unconscious, it is believed that Kristen then began administering fentanyl patches on his body. Although fentanyl is a legal drug and is many times stronger than morphine, it still takes time to work its way from the skin patches into the bloodstream. It's alleged that Kristen spent the day shuttling back and forth between work and their apartment while she continued to place fentanyl patches on Greg's body. At 12:10, Kristen was witnessed erratically pulling into her apartment complex, illegally parking and running upstairs. 10 minutes later, after looking in on her dying husband, she called Dr. Robertson. It was during that conversation prosecutors would argue at trial that the couple finalized plans to stage Greg's death as a suicide. After the call, she drove straight to the grocery store where she admitted purchasing cold medicine and canned soup. Later, it would be discovered there was a third item purchased that day, a single rose. According to her store discount card, this transaction was completed at 12:41 p.m. At this point in the day, according to forensic evidence, Greg would have been in a deep and crippling coma, struggling against the drugs that were overpowering his body's will to live. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Kristen was back at the lab again, looking frazzled and upset. An hour later, she left again, making the 15-minute drive back to her place. Her apartment manager recalled seeing her car parked askew next to her own car when she left for lunch at 2:45 p.m. Just after 3 o'clock p.m., Dr. Robertson suddenly left work to meet Kristen near her home. For the next few hours, they would be together, later providing each other with alibis.
It is alleged that during this time, Dr. Robertson was the one to inject Greg's left arm with the final and lethal dose of fentanyl. Later, experts would testify that he was given enough fentanyl to kill him many times over.
At 6:30 p.m., Kristen drove back to the medical examiner's office one last time, claiming she returned only to turn off the HPLC machine. Authorities believe she actually returned to dump evidence. When Kristen returned to her apartment 90 minutes later, Greg was almost certainly dead. It was then that investigators believed she was carefully setting the scene for his suicide, quote-unquote. This is how investigators reconstructed Kristen's actions over the next hour and a half.
Inspired by her favorite movie, American Beauty, Kristen took the red rose that she had bought earlier and scattered the fresh petals around Greg's body. Then she took their favorite framed wedding photo, placed it by his head, and carefully left her journal open on a nearby table. She also wrote a note to Greg, which she placed near the bed. It read, "Hi, Sleepy. I'm going to go shopping and get a wedding gift for Barb. Leftovers are in the fridge for you. I hope you feel better, and I'll see you later." At about 9 p.m., satisfied that everything was in place, she took a quick shower and put on her pajamas. She then smoked some crystal methamphetamine before calling 911 from the cordless phone in the kitchen. Unfortunately, the 911 operators were about to ruin Kristen's careful staging by insisting she perform CPR on Greg. Her first instruction was to move Greg from the bed to the floor. While pretending to give CPR, She removed all the rose petals from the bed and carefully replaced them all around Greg on the floor. She also moved the wedding photo to the floor and propped it next to a dresser by his head. According to investigators, Kristen began to blow into the phone, pretending she was administering CPR to Greg. Just as the operator told her to pump Greg's chest about 15 times, the paramedics arrived while Kristen was holding the phone in the living room, nowhere near Greg's body. She cried into the phone that they had arrived and burst into tears. Later, paramedics would testify there were no marks on Greg's chest, which would have been visible if Kristen had actually been performing CPR. They stated Greg was pale with blue lips and he looked dead. They also remember the bed looking freshly made, as if no one had been sleeping in it. Campus police arrived shortly after the paramedics and joined in assisting the paramedics in resuscitating Greg DeVillers. Campus Officer Preciado noticed that other than the blue lips, the 26-year-old looked extremely fit and healthy. He also noticed red smudges or blotches on the beige carpet, which he mistook for blood. When he reached for the smudges, they moved. He realized they were red rose petals. Greg felt warm to the touch, and it was evident he had recently taken his last breath. Paramedics were determined to make every effort to bring Greg back and intubated him, and then hooked him up to a heart monitor. Sadly, the monitor continued to register a flat line. Greg onto a backboard for transport to the hospital, he immediately noticed an absence of rose petals under the body. If Greg had been originally covered in rose petals and dragged from the bed onto the floor for CPR, why weren't there rose petals under his body? The paramedic took a quick scan around the room, looking to see what could have caused this seemingly healthy 26-year-old man to die. Other than a bottle of cough syrup, there was an absence of prescription pill vials or signs of illegal drug use. Nothing looked out of place, and there wasn't a suicide note at the scene. Campus Officer Preciado asked Kristen if her husband suffered from any medical problems or was taking any medication. An agitated Kristen repeated that her husband had overdosed on pills. This was her theory on Greg's death. She then walked into the bathroom and produced a Vicodin pill bottle. As paramedics desperately fought to revive Greg, additional uniformed campus police officers arrived at 9:27 and began interviewing Kristen in the kitchen. She tearfully repeated her story that Greg had been ill the previous day and had overdosed on medication. Upon arriving at the hospital, Kristen called Dr. Robertson and asked him to come to the hospital to give her emotional support. He arrived 15 minutes later and immediately put his arms around Kristen and held her hand. Kristen then answered all the nurses' questions and provided Greg's medical background. Kristen at this point offered her second theory on what may have caused Greg's condition. She surmised he may have taken some old prescriptions she had purchased in Tijuana 5 years earlier when she'd been trying to wean herself off crystal meth. It was at this time that the nurse informed Kristen that her husband had been declared dead. It was exactly 6 days before his 27th birthday.
After allowing the news of Greg's death to sink in, a social worker approached Kristen about donating Greg's organs and tissue. By 11:30 p.m., Kristen had signed all the necessary paperwork donating Greg's corneas, heart valves, skin, and some of his bones before heading home with Dr. Robertson. Meanwhile, earlier that day, when Greg DeVillers failed to show up for work, his boss, Dr. Grunwald, became concerned. The lack of communication was out of character for Greg, who was usually a reliable, dependable employee. The doctor immediately began phoning Greg at his home. Each time he called, there was no answer. He eventually asked another employee named Terry to keep trying. Eventually, by 7 p.m., Kristen picked up the phone. Kristen informed Terry that Greg hadn't been feeling well and was sleeping. The call left Terry feeling uneasy, and he sensed a strange tone in Kristen's voice. She sounded annoyed and hurried by his call. Left with a feeling of unease, Terry wondered why Kristen wouldn't let him speak to Greg. If Greg had been home all day, why hadn't he answered the phone one of the many times he had been called? Later that evening, around 9 p.m., Dr. Grunwald again called Greg's home. This time, Kristen answered, crying, stating Greg was dying and the paramedics were trying to save his life. She then got off the phone, promising to call him back with an update. She never called him back. When Marie was unable to get information from the hospital, she had her older son Jerome call, and they again were refused information on Greg's condition. When they called Constance Rossum, they were told her husband Ralph was at the hospital and would call them with any updates. Jerome called again and insisted on more information from the nurse, who finally informed him that Greg had passed away. Jerome was shocked. He told his brother Bertrand, and Bertrand drove to his mother's condo so the tight-knit family could grieve together. It was during this time that Jerome decided to share some information with his mother that he had been holding back about Kristen. He told her Kristen was a former meth user. Jerome shared his concerns that Kristen could be involved in Greg's death. His mother, who loved Kristen, wouldn't hear about it. Meanwhile, Campus Police Sergeant Bob Jones met with Kristen and Dr. Robertson on the landing in front of her apartment. Detective Jones asked Dr. Robertson to remain outside while he sat down at the dining room table with Kristen to go over her version of events that night. She told Detective Jones that she and Greg had been fighting all week, and it had started the previous Thursday when she announced she would be moving out. They had dinner with her parents on Friday night, and they spent Saturday night together, and Greg, still upset over Kristen's decision to leave, had taken some of her old prescriptions to help him sleep. He continued to sleep all day on Monday as well. She worked only 15 minutes away and was so concerned about Greg she had come home several times that day to continue checking on him. She found him breathing a little loudly at times, but otherwise he seemed fine. She said they had soup together at lunch, and this is when Greg admitted taking some of her old drugs that she had used to wean herself off of meth 5 years earlier. The medications were oxycodone and clonazepam. When asked for the prescription bottles, Kristen explained that Greg had thrown them out years earlier, but secretly kept the pills without her knowledge. Kristen went on to explain that she had several errands to run that day after work and returned home to a sleeping Greg. She decided to unwind from her day by taking a long, relaxing shower and bath. She was about to go to bed sometime around 9 p.m. when she leaned over to kiss Greg and realized that he was cold and not breathing, and she immediately called 911. Medical examiner investigator Angie Wagner arrived around 1 a.m. and asked Kristen her own series of questions for her report. After the interviews were over, Ralph Rossum drove his daughter back to their family home in Claremont, California. Kristen seemed inconsolable. Investigators in the medical examiner's office believed that this was a case of suicide. The next morning, Greg's boss was about to call Greg again when he received a cryptic phone call from Dr. Robertson regarding Greg. Dr. Michael Robertson introduced himself as Kristen's boss and gave the doctor Kristen's phone number in Claremont. He said he couldn't give